Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 50.
I got to the point where I just didn't even want to consume the news anymore.
We've all been there. The news can feel like it's draining our soul. It's all conflict, chaos, and there's no space to breathe. But what if we could flip the script? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and I'm sitting down with Julie Rose, host of Top of Mind, a podcast designed to challenge the noise and leave you feeling more enlightened and empowered instead of outraged. Julie will share how she transformed her burnout from the daily news grind into a mission for meaningful, complex, and hopeful conversations. We're talking about breaking out of media's obsession with simplicity and conflict, staying curious in the face of discomfort, and strategies to mindfully engage with the news in a way that doesn't just inform but uplifts. This conversation might just change the way you listen forever. Let's get to it right now. Julie Rose is a broadcast journalist, interviewer, and radio show host. She hosts Top of Mind on BYU Radio. Julie is also a multiple winner of Edward R. Murrow Awards. That's amazing. Thank you, Julie, for coming on our little show.
David, it's my pleasure. I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. So your show features, I think I'm quoting from one of your notes or one of your show overviews that says smart, informative conversations and interviews that go beyond mere headlines and sound bites. So tell us a little bit about that, kind of contrasting it with your approach, contrasting your approach with sort of the typical media that tends to thrive on anger and division.
Right. So maybe if I could just give you, I think if I explain very briefly the origin story of Top of Mind as a podcast, it might help just a little bit to understand where I'm coming from here. So as you mentioned, I have been a radio journalist for 20 years. I spent the first half of my career in public radio reporting. So I reported for public radio affiliates, NPR stations in Salt Lake City and in North Carolina. And that's where I won national and regional Edward R. Murrow awards for my reporting. I contributed frequently to Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and was very much in the sort of breaking news, feature news, really probing, challenging important issues in our community. And I loved it. I am a journalist. But when I got to Provo, Utah, Brigham Young University, which is located here, was just getting started with a Sirius XM satellite radio. And I was a daily news interviewer talking about what's going on in the world every single day for 2 hours. I did, more than 10,000 interviews in the course of 7 years. And during that time, I started to, towards the end, just really get burned out on the news. The way everything just felt like bad news. It felt like everything was a conflict. There were good guys and bad guys. And I always felt this pressure to talk to, if I'm going to talk to one person, then I needed to talk to the opposite perspective, and constantly trying to sort of make sure that everything felt unbiased and balanced. And that was a really important part of what we were trying to do in our conversations. But it started to feel harder and harder to have calm, thoughtful, nuanced conversations. It just seemed like the battle lines were more and more drawn between the Republicans and the Democrats, the Trump supporters and everyone else, the good guys and the bad guys, whatever. On any issue, it just felt more and more polarizing. I know this is something that you talk a lot about. And I got to the point where I just didn't even want to consume the news anymore. But I was like, it was my job. I'd come to work and I'd begrudgingly open up the newspapers and sort of go through what was going on in the world. And then as soon as I could, I would turn it all off and go live in my little bubble of escapist novels and audiobooks and music, right? And I felt increasingly like what I really wanted to do was just be done with the news. I just wanted to no longer have to pay attention. But I pretty quickly realized that wasn't going to work for me personally. Because I also really care about what's happening in the world. I care about voting. I care about the state of democracy. I care about the choices that are being made in my community that affect people of all ethnicities and income levels. And I knew that if I just buried my head in the sand, I would not be able to contribute productively as a voter, as a member of my community, as a neighbor. So how am I going to consume the news in a way that's not going to leave me feeling angry and anxious and depressed? Oh, by the way, I have clinical anxiety. So there's that, it wasn't helping at all with my kind of predisposal to depression and anxiety. And that's where we started to think it just so happened. This was a moment where things came together, where our management was looking to shift our daily radio show to a weekly podcast. And we were given a bit of a blank slate and said, okay, take the DNA of what you are as a journalist and this news show you've been doing. And what would you do? Here's your playground. What would you do with this? And that's where I started to say, there are more people out there. I learned that 40% of Americans, close to 40%, actively avoid the news. I'm not the only one that's frustrated by how the news makes me feel, by the tenor of it, by how overwhelming it is. Could we create a podcast that would be for people like me and all those others out there, people who want to engage with important issues, but want to also come away feeling enlightened, empowered, optimistic, not just, oh man, the world's just a terrible place and all those other people are terrible people and, that kind of a thing. And so that's what we set out to do with Top of Mind. So that's our goal. So we take one tough topic in each episode, like no hot takes allowed. If you want hot takes and snappy pundit sound bites, there are plenty of choices for you out there in the world. I want nuanced perspectives, and I want to hear from people who have personal experience with these issues. Not just people who are standing on the outside saying, this is how the good guys think about this topic. And I wanted complexity. One of the things I realized was that I, as a journalist, and the media in general, have a bias for simplicity. Great stories. I mean, it's why we love fairy tales, There's good and evil, right? But we also really like anti-heroes. We like complicated, main characters of our popular TV shows. We can become engaged in complicated stories. It's just that they're a little harder to sort of get into sometimes, or to sort of be willing to invest in. And what I thought we could try to do, and what we try to do with every episode of Top of Mind, is lean into the complexity. So if you have someone who you think is on this side of an issue, and based on their political identity and their racial identity and their religious identity and where they live in the country, you're like, oh, this is a stereotypical right-wing conservative Trump supporter or a left-wing liberal Biden supporter, right? And then it turns out that they actually also have some counterintuitive views that seem, well, that doesn't make any sense. How can you have that view if you're this kind of person? Our instinct is to want to dismiss that, or to be like, well, you're an unreliable source. I'm not going to talk to you. A lot of times even journalists want to, they're like, well, when you're in the editing process, you're feeling a little bit like, I really need to have a clearer storytelling. I want this simplicity. It makes for better storytelling, easier storytelling a lot of times, especially when you have people's limited attention. And we have made the conscious choice to lean into the complexity.
Well, I think one thing that our shows have in common on that is, I get a lot of feedback that sometimes my audience is sort of angry that they didn't get a nice, clear answer. And angry may not be the right word, but more like frustrated.
Frustrated, yeah.
And I think that we have to get more comfortable with that, right? I mean, I think that's more like reality. So, and I think it's just, and I think another thing that our shows have in common is almost everything about our shows is sort of counter to the way you might normally, all the rules, all the sort of the sort of set guidelines that someone would give how you make a show and what the points have to be, right? Because you get a person that is very assertive in their position and they're very clear on it, and you're going to do this in 2.5 minutes, and and our shows are just not that at all, right? We're explicitly looking for these people with these more nuanced opinions.
Absolutely. And here's something that I learned that and I knew it kind of from my own reporting experience, although I've never been on one of these cable news sort of debate shows, right? But something that I learned, that for me, just really kind of highlights the false nature of what we get from too often from the media. I mean, I don't want to be in a position here where I'm like blaming the media, all media are terrible or whatever. But I've already acknowledged that we have this bias for simplicity. We also have a bias for conflict. Like we as news consumers, I mean, look, we like the stories that are cut and dried. We share the stories that make us feel something really visceral, those are the ones we click and share or type and comment on, even if we only read the first two lines in the headline, right? But it gives us a false sense of binariness in the world, and none of us is as cut and dried. And I have a lot of identities in my life. I'm an aunt, I'm a sister, I'm a woman, I'm a single woman, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I'm a journalist, I'm a Provo resident, I live in Grandview, which is a neighborhood, like that's part of my identity. I'm a homeowner, kind of a lot of these things. I'm a fan of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, So these are all parts of who I am that make up my identity. And on any given day, one or the other of those is going to be more salient to me. But we walk around sort of assuming that everyone has just one identity. We're so quick to say, oh, well, the only identity that I see in you that really matters is how you vote, or, what you say about this politician on social media. When we're all more complex than that. And I would be offended if you took just one of my identities and made all of your decisions about me based on that one identity, because I'm way more complicated than that. Everybody is. And when we can extend one another the grace to be curious about that, well, that's a little weird, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Well, but also like you're this or, whatever. A lot of times our identities come into conflict with one another. And that's the beauty of connections and human relationships. But when you look at what goes on often in news coverage, especially political discussions in news coverage, people, when they are hired or when they're recruited to come and be on one of these like debate type or, pundit panel conversations on a cable news channel, the producers coach those participants to embrace the most extreme position they are comfortable embracing and to stick to it and to have no flexibility in their position because they want a good debate. You don't want a lot of people saying, oh, well, I agree with you on that, but I see it a little differently over here. Like, that's not very exciting if you have 5 minutes and you need to get some eyeballs. You want to see fireworks. But humans are way more complex. And I think we just don't get enough, we don't have enough modeling of that. So we know it inherently that we're more complicated as people, but we don't have a lot of opportunity to practice that. And we don't see it modeled very often in the kinds of media we consume.
Yeah, for sure. And talking about how we sort of want to see this fiery stuff, I had an interesting conversation with a political scientist a while back, Andreas Schedler, and he was talking about how a lot of the scientists and researchers and others I talked to sort of say that same thing, like we want this kind of we don't want a more nuanced conversation because it seems quote unquote boring. And he sort of pushed back on that, and he sort of said, it's become to the point now that those are the boring conversations because everybody's doing that. And
100%.
The interesting conversations are these more nuanced ones where you do take this position of just the things you were describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, look, it's why I think there are a lot of people out there who really like, superhero, the superhero genre type films. But more and more these days, these are complicated sort of, I don't know. There are anti-hero superheroes, or if you think about like Breaking Bad, right? Had this hero that was definitely doing a lot of bad things, or, there's definitely, I think we have a lot more capacity and we are more surprised, but I think it comes as a surprise to people. Well, how can you have a superhero who's not the good guy all the time? Well, guess what? Here's a superhero that has a really interesting backstory that does some bad things sometimes. And we find that really engaging because and the trick is to stay curious in those moments when we're uncomfortable or when we when we identify something that feels counterintuitive, when somebody espouses something that in a conversation that feels like a turnoff to you or is surprising in any way, like to notice that and to get curious about it rather than allow yourself to be afraid of it or turned off by it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, oh, this person supports X. Oh, wait, they also support Y? Well, that's not supposed to go together, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So coming back to something you said kind of in the beginning and your personal experience, and I see this a lot, is sort of stepping away from the news as like a self-preservation. And, you're seeing this more. And for some people, I totally get it. Like I don't even say you need to get back into the news, right? If you really need to get away, then you need to get away. But like you said, I mean, to some point we do need civic engagement, and you do see a lot of younger people in particular, according to a lot of the polling and stats and so on, that have disengaged a lot. They're not really consuming news almost at all. Like not explicitly seeking news per se.
They're passive. That's the word. They're passive consumers. Yeah. 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 It's just flowing over you. You think you're informed on it. Like everybody thinks they know what's going on in the world because it's impossible unless you're literally like, someplace without any phone access. and isolated by yourself for an extended period of time, you can't not know what's going on in the world. But when you're passively consuming, you're really not making any intentional effort. You're just sort of like, it's flowing over you in social media. People are talking about it. You're hearing it as you passing. And that's actually really risky. That's part of what fuels the reason people are so bugged by the news, because they're allowing themselves to be yanked around by the algorithms that are intentionally trying to upset them.
Right. And in some cases, maybe even trying to intentionally, have an agenda of some sort beyond that to steer people in certain directions.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What do you think we can do? I mean, I was going to ask the question: do we think it's a problem? You just kind of already stated that you think it's a problem. So
yes.
So what do you think we can do about it?
I think that news avoidance is a problem for a lot of reasons, and I think we've kind of touched on those. So my hacks for this have been that I make the conscious decision when I go in to consume news. All right, what am I trying to do here? Do I only have 5 minutes and I just want to scroll all the headlines in a national paper? Great. That's my decision, but I'm going to time limit it. I'm not going to scroll for 30 minutes. If I have 20 minutes, I would rather, and I'm consuming just for the sake of trying to understand what's going on in the world, right? To feeling connected. If I have 20 minutes, I would rather skim for 3 minutes of headlines, pick one article, read the whole article. I try to make the practice of defaulting towards going deep rather than staying broad and shallow. And I also try to, I'm also exercising my attention span, trying to expand it a little bit I'll make a rule that I'm not going to read the first paragraph and then bail out because it's boring and go read something else, because then I've really done no more than the same thing what I do with Netflix. It's like watch the first minute and then turn it off and do something else and watch the first minute. Like so I make the conscious decision that I'm going to choose one article. I'm going to read it top to bottom. And the end. That's my news consumption for the day. If that's all I can manage, I'm going to go deep. I'm going to read the whole article. I'm going to break myself of the habit of bailing out the minute I feel like I'm seeing stuff that I don't agree with, or I feel like this has a bias. Instead, I'm going to get curious about that. If I get 2 paragraphs in and I find myself not wanting to continue reading, then I stop and ask myself, well, why? Is it because I feel like this is biased? Is it because I feel like there are perspectives they're leaving out? What are those perspectives? I wonder why they would have left those perspectives out. Maybe they are biased, or maybe those perspectives are hard to find, or maybe this was an article that was written on deadline and those people didn't call back in time. I want to start. It's a way to start thinking critically and keep myself lean in with curiosity. And then the other thing that I will say that I have started to do is practice engaging with ideas that I disagree with intentionally. So sometimes when I'm doing the deep rather than shallow, I'll have a topic. So maybe this week, immigration, or what's going on in Ukraine is my big thing. Or maybe this week I'm really interested in bridge safety and what happened in Baltimore. And I'm going to every day, the articles that I'm reading are going to go deeper and deeper on that particular issue. I've intentionally chosen this week, I'm going to try to become an expert on this topic. And so every day I'm going to pick one article about that and I'm going to read it top to bottom. Okay. Or go searching for other for articles on that from different perspectives. And then I'll be like, today I read one on Fox News, and tomorrow I'm going to go read one on MSNBC. And then I'm going to go look in the Wall Street Journal, and I'm going to be intentionally trying to broaden my view of this one issue that I'm going deep on. I do that for a week, and I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to go move on to some other topic. I am still at the end of that week way more capable of having nuanced conversations and making more informed decisions than I would have been if I hadn't gone deep. So, but then back to the, sometimes what I try to do, and this one I have found is the most useful in terms of practical ability to help me do this more in my daily life is I will, my article for the day, I will go to the opinion section of the website, the newspaper or whatever. And I pick the one that I feel like I most disagree with based on the headline. And then I read it top to bottom. And I notice how I'm feeling. I notice the arguments that they're making. I notice the personal stories that they're sharing. And it's an opportunity for me to practice staying present when I feel really uncomfortable or threatened by a perspective. And the hope is that I'll be able to take that then into my daily life. I will have practiced it in the safety of my own iPad. And next time, I'm face to face with you, David, and you espouse a position that I disagree with, I'm not going to freak out. I'm going to know that it's okay. I can feel uncomfortable here. I'm going to get curious. Let's talk about it.
Interesting. And that is almost like that is sort of, you would think that would be it's counterintuitive that would sort of help with the anxiety. But as you start to build that it's like you're training yourself almost.
It's a muscle. I go to the gym. It's my like, yes, my ability to stay uncomfortable muscles that I have to practice with. Yeah.
I think And there's a lot of that stuff that's not natural that you do have to practice.
It's absolutely not natural. We have been sort of conditioned to think that if you feel uncomfortable, we've been conditioned to feel threatened by perspectives we disagree with. We've been conditioned to either lash out or bail out. And neither of those is the only way to do it, nor are either of them necessarily productive. There's another way, which is to get curious, to stay open, recognize that I don't have to believe what's being what I'm reading here. This person isn't trying to change my mind, or maybe they might be, but I don't have to change my mind. What I'm trying to do is learn how they think and, learn their perspective more clearly so that maybe I can better argue for my view, right? I'm going to come away someday. I would really encourage people. Soon there will be a movie coming out on PBS and then available on Amazon called The Basement Talks. And we actually did an episode of this on Top of Mind about a year and a half ago. About these conversations that took place between leaders on both sides of the abortion issue in Boston in the 1990s, and the remarkable transformation that those conversations had, sort of what they were afraid of, how they didn't think that having these conversations, there was any point to it. They didn't see why they should talk with people they disagree with and were never going to change their minds, and there's no common ground, and et cetera, and et cetera, et cetera. They ended up meeting secretly for 6 years, and it was transformative, and it also changed the tenor of the rhetoric in their community, brought down the temperature in a way that was measurable and really crucial at that moment. So it's a great, eye-opening story about how valuable it can be simply to sit in the presence with an open mind of a view that you deeply disagree with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and often that kind of stuff does get it's easy to get just be kind of don't feel like that stuff's gonna ever do very much. I hear that a lot from scientists that sort of say, yeah, that's great, but I just don't have much faith in that ever achieving anything.
In terms of talking with one another.
Yeah, and I think that you've got to start somewhere, and I think it can have a big, but it's easy to lose hope about it because there's a lot of people that think it's not going to work or it won't scale or whatever.
It's true. This is and so for me, the criticism that you raise about you're not going to necessarily change the world by bringing together two people who disagree and having them, there have to be ground rules, there has to be trust, there has to be structure. But what I have realized is that I just didn't have the confidence or the skills to have a one-on-one conversation with a family member that I disagree with on a political issue. Yes, it went badly every single time. And it felt like a trap. I felt like I didn't know how to get out of that. And so, yes, it seems to me like, well, just putting people in the room together, that's not going to fix anything and probably going to make it worse. What I realized is even if they're not interested in having a productive dialogue, the way I was approaching a lot of those encounters was not productive. I was going in thinking that I needed to convince them or fact check them. So my goals were misplaced because that's never going to happen. Most people are not just going to change their minds in the course of an argument. And I was letting this threat response sort of run the show. And so I actually started putting some of the mindful breathing and kind of meditation mindfulness practices that I'd learned to help with my anxiety. I started implementing some of those in these interpersonal interactions. I had never spent so much time sitting and listening so closely to the opposing viewpoint. And having done that, I realize now how to make my case, how to advocate for my views even more effectively. I know how to counter. I know what kinds of things to advocate for. I know where there is and there isn't any wiggle room on either side. I believe that the value is that you'll feel new empathy. You'll gain more clarity on your own views, which will help you become a better advocate for the things you care about. Changing your mind doesn't have to be the point. Dialogue can still bring you benefits. Personally, it is possible, even on an interpersonal level, that we can have better conversations about these difficult issues. And how do we scale it? I don't know. Although I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to start with our political world. I don't think that politicians are going to create, but I do think that community leaders, I think thought leaders, I think the media, I think there are a lot of places where we each have a circle of influence where we can learn how to and then start to model and we can practice it. You don't have to go enroll in a training, although great if you want to. But even just doing something as simple as practicing on a regular basis, engaging deeply with an opinion article that you deeply disagree with, like that is part of strengthening that muscle and learning how to engage more effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah. Julie Rose, I really appreciate it. My audience, I'm sure would. I mean, I'd talk to you for 2 more hours, and my audience probably wants me to ask 10 more questions. But I'm so glad you made the time for us. I really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. I would encourage people to check out our Top of Mind podcast. It's Top of Mind with Julie Rose on all the podcast apps where you can get these deep dives into some of these conversations. And we also have a companion series called Stick With It. And David, you have appeared recently on the podcast talking about a time when you made the choice to stay uncomfortable, to stay present and, not back away when you encountered difficult information that challenged you. So would love to have people check that out as well. It's been great talking with you.
Yeah, it's been great having you on. And yes, definitely check out that podcast. It's really awesome. It really fits. If you like this show, you'll definitely like that one. So yeah, thanks again. And we'll see you soon. And that is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If you enjoyed this episode, if you found it interesting, please tell some friends about it. Post it to your social media. Better yet, text someone. Even better, talk to someone in real life. Tell them about this show. I really appreciate it. Okay, see you in a week or two.